Welcome to the Luke Macias Show. Early voting is underway. We're going to talk about a little bit of what we're seeing when it comes to just the first day of early voting. We're also going to talk about new polling that came out and what it revealed about just how conservative many Texans are regarding the policy they want, even if the presidential election is closer than most of us would like. Donald Trump will win Texas. He's just not going to win by the margin that most of us would like to see him win by. We're also going to talk about the horrific actions of the Texas House of Representatives under the leadership of Joe Moody and Jeff Leach, who have basically decided that the whole three branches of government thing we have, not really a thing. We can ignore that. We've got a lot to cover today. Let's get to the show. In some ways, it feels like quite a while since I've been able to sit down and talk to you, the listeners and viewers of this show. The last two episodes were filmed up in Fort Worth. I had a child that was born 4 weeks ago, and so I recorded some shows before that, and then went on the road a couple weeks after. I didn't travel for 2 weeks. That was my commitment to my wife, and I fulfilled that commitment. And then I was up in DFW and had to film 2 shows up there. And so I haven't been in studio for like a month. And I don't know. I think I communicate differently when I'm here talking to you. It's at my home office. I'm able to just come and pull some thoughts together and try to address these things. On the road, it just feels different when you're recording these shows and I'm traveling. I'm doing this a little earlier than I expected to, just because we record this on this platform, and somebody else was using it, so I had to jump on early enough. I don't have other teams here when I record, so some of you have asked about this, but I have cameras set up, and it all is done on the cloud. I know I sound old when I call it the cloud, but the point is somebody else is remote and they're able to kind of come in and see everything and then take it all, download it, edit it, all of that. So have a great team. Cannot say enough about the team here that is able to produce this show on a weekly basis. The fact that they were willing to go on the road and up in DFW to record the conversation we had with Beau French, the Tarrant County GOP chair, and David Cook, who is the speaker candidate who is running with a majority of the Republican caucus supporting his race for speaker. And if you didn't have a chance to listen to that, I would go back and listen to that episode or watch that episode. One of the things that David addresses is a lot of the different reforms that he has committed to as part of getting a majority of the Republicans to get behind him. The significant reforms that he's willing to enact as speaker, which I believe would open up the path, widen the path to many conservative policies passing. And so I appreciate him sitting down. It is the only interview he has done since launching his campaign for speaker. He has not sat down and gone on record with any other group or publication. And so I'm grateful that he was willing to sit down with us and dive into some of that information. I was recently at a fundraiser for Mike Alcott. And Mike, y'all know, is a good friend of mine. In fact, this is just a couple days ago. And so I went and I had to MC for that event. And there were 425 grassroots Texans in that room. Just think of that. I mean, it was funny because we had some people that I was meeting with from another state. Okay. And these are individuals who are trying to organize and build conservative infrastructure in another state. And this is a state that is smaller, and it's also a state that is slightly blue. Okay. So it's kind of a light blue state that people want to eventually make red. And these are Republican operatives, and they came to this event because they were in town. We were meeting with them, talking about various strategies to begin to move a state towards the right. And they were in awe that there was a state representative that had 425 people who would show up to an event for him. And they're like, we don't have our statewide elected officials. Our statewide Republican candidates can't get 400 people in a dinner. And Mike Alcott got those people because he's a true grassroots individual who has poured his heart and soul and time and talent and treasure into helping other people. And those are the individuals that we want to serve, right? It is by serving that you are then put in a position where people say, we want to be served by you, because we've seen you continue to sacrifice for the betterment of Texas. I'm doing this a little earlier, so I had to go get coffee on the way. Normally, I make coffee at my house. I'm a little bit of a coffee snob because my wife and I have a espresso machine, and that's what we make. But I'm trying Whataburger iced coffee for maybe the second time in my life. Okay, and as a Texan, I'm a huge Whataburger fan. But I will say that if you're gonna do coffee at Whataburger, you need to do iced coffee with some sugary thing. Now, that's not how I normally have my coffee. I do just a straight cappuccino, a little bit of the steamed milk, and that's it. I don't do flavoring or anything like that. But Whataburger's not known for its coffee, and there's a reason. And they're probably not going to be known for a long time, if ever, for their coffee. And so just a word of discernment to you if you are getting your coffee at Whataburger because you're having to leave earlier than you thought and you need coffee on the way. My recommendation would be to get an iced coffee and get caramel in there, something that kind of covers up the fact that this coffee leaves a lot that could be given. Okay, so with that, early voting's going on. We are seeing massive turnout. And a lot of that turnout is more Republican than normal. Now, let me give you the good and the bad. And there's more good than bad in this, okay? So the good news is Republicans are turning out sooner after the first day of early voting statewide in 2020. Democrat primary voters over Republican primary voters had a 100,000 vote lead. There were 100,000 more Democrat primary voters in Texas that voted on the first day of early voting and the mail-in ballots that had come in so far than Republicans. And after Monday's votes were tallied up by Tuesday afternoon, Republican primary voters had a 100,000 vote lead. Now, let me explain what that means. Because if any of you are following different conservative accounts online and stuff, you'll see all these reports out there about how Republicans are outvoting Democrats. And that is true. It's happening nationwide right now. But here's what we don't know. What we don't know is how many election day voters were simply moving to earlier in the process. Carrie Lake would be the governor of Arizona if Republicans had all gotten out and voted early. She would win. She would have won. She'd be the governor. She didn't do that. And Republicans told their voters to vote on Election Day. And then there were a lot of errors and there were long lines. And we had situations like in Harris County where the Democrats were under providing intentionally, I believe. They were intentionally under supplying Republican areas with the paper it needed to print off enough ballots for the voters that were all going to come out. And so 2 years ago, it might have cost us the Harris County judge race. Alex Mueller might be the county judge in Harris County, the largest red county in Texas, the largest county in Texas. And it could have had a red county judge if Republicans had all voted early. And the same thing with the state of Arizona. I know I'm speaking a little softer than normal. You just have to know that I basically had this kind of crud for like a week and a half or so, and I can't really kick it. It's probably because my wonderful, amazing son, Leo Vincent Macias, who's now a little over 4 weeks old, is keeping us up a lot. And so I feel like whatever I got a week and a half ago, I can't shake because I can't, sleep, which if my wife is listening or watching this, she's going to be more than a little upset with me because she definitely sleeps less than I do. So I just want the record to show that my wife, she sleeps way less than I do. So whatever amount of sleep I'm complaining about, it's a lot more sleep than my wife is getting right now. Okay, just so the record shows that. I kind of forget where I'm at, but I think we're talking about early voting. So what we don't know is how many voters we're just moving to earlier in the process. That doesn't necessarily mean that the end result is going to be a lot better. So you'll see things like, oh, in Pennsylvania, Republicans, if you look at the early vote, have an 8% advantage compared to where they were in 2020 or 2022. And the problem is that Republicans were not as much early voters and were more election day voters. We are generally more election day oriented voters. Okay. That is just how we tend to behave. And there is a big push, which I believe this is appropriate, for people to vote early. Last night, I was texting a friend of mine at church, and this is a friend who moved here from New York and then did not register to vote in time to vote in 2022. And yeah, he moved here in order to move away from the madness and into safety. And so, of course, I gave him a hard time for not registering to vote in time. So he registered to vote. He came to me like 6 months ago. I registered to vote. Fantastic. So I texted him last night. I say, hey, have you voted yet? And he said, I'm waiting till election day. And I was like, go vote tomorrow. and so he asked me for my explanation. I told him about Harris County. I told him about all these other things that I'm telling y'all about with Arizona. And he said, got it. I'll vote this week. So if you know anyone who you think is less likely to vote, this is the time to tell them to vote. Don't tell them to wait till election day. Tell them to go vote now. I'm going to remind y'all, it's a little different in November, but it is still the same. When you go vote, this is how you vote more than once. You need to go vote. You need to stick that I voted sticker on. You need to take a picture. You need to post it on your social media platforms, whatever you have. And if you have like a church email list you're on, because some of y'all are older, you're a bunch of boomers. I love you because I see you all over the place. But, maybe y'all are the type that email these things out. So email out your church list and say, guys, I voted today. It wasn't that bad. The line was only 20 minutes. Please go vote. You can vote any like for me, it's in Bexar County. I can say you can vote anywhere in Bexar County. I'll tell you where to vote. You have to lower the barrier to entry for these people. Now, on your email list, if there's people that are Democrats, don't email them. But for anybody else, email them. And tell them, hey, I voted. I've done research on these different candidates, different local races. Let me know if you have any questions. And it's very helpful. It just is. People will reach out. Hey, I saw this ballot proposition. Hey, I saw this deal. Hey, do you know about this Court of Appeals race that's going on? And you can give them your insight and then encourage them to get out and vote. So early voting numbers are great, but what we don't know is how much are we just taking election day voters and moving them into the early voting bucket. So do not fall for the idea that the Republican advantage, quote unquote, that you are hearing about nationwide is an actual advantage. The Republican Party has emphasized early voting more than it ever has, which I think is a good thing. The problem is we might give ourselves more confidence than we deserve. And we might just take some of our election day voters and put them into the early voting bucket, which makes things look a lot rosier, but it might take away that election day advantage we typically get. So my encouragement to you is to get out and vote. We've got a state to protect, and you can't protect it if you don't actually engage. Now, I know, because I've met so many, like y'all are voters, but there are people in your lives, like my friend at church, who are not as engaged as you and I. And you have to think about those people. You have to think about who those people are in your life and just shoot them a quick note and say, hey, wanted to encourage you to get out and vote this week. And the best time to do it is right after you vote. If you want to go a step above just posting on your socials and email blasting it out, what you do is you take that picture on your phone and you go through your contacts and you look for the people that you know care about the state and the country, but you could kind of sense maybe are less likely to vote. Okay, maybe they're younger, maybe they're not as engaged. And just shoot them a text with a picture. Hey, I just voted. It took 15 minutes, 30 minutes, took whatever. Did some research with the candidates. Would really appreciate if you get out and vote. Here are some of the people that I know are really important to keep, and then put people, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, whatever you want to do. Tell them about a couple of those local, lower down the ballot races that you're engaged in. We have a really important sheriff's race going on in Tarrant County, right? If you're in Tarrant County, you go, we've got a great sheriff in our community. He's going to keep our community safe. The other guy is a nut job. So just come on. And they go, oh, I didn't even think about who the sheriff is. I'll go out and vote. Okay. Now, Texans for Fiscal Responsibility released some polling a couple days ago on Monday. And it was very insightful, in my opinion. This is an October poll in Texas. And just to give you perspective, I think this poll actually is a little more blue than the state of Texas is. What I mean by that is, in this poll, 41% of voters who took it said they were Republican, 29% said they were Democrat, 23% said they were independent. They said in the election in general, who are you going to vote for, a Republican or a Democrat? It was 46% Republican, 41% Democrat. And then with the presidential ballot, it was, I'm looking here, Donald Trump was at 48% and Kamala Harris was at 43%. So Donald Trump had a 5-point lead. He beat Joe Biden by 6%. My current prediction, if I had to say, is he'll probably beat Kamala Harris by more than 6%. I just don't know how much more. But my point being that this poll is probably a little, just a couple points more blue than the actual state of Texas. Interestingly enough, they asked what people's opinion was of Joe Rogan. He has a 31% favorable opinion, 26% negative opinion. I thought that was just an interesting little tidbit. That's not the main thing that I think it matters, but I do think that was just an interesting insight into where Texans fall on a very well-known person like Joe Rogan. Here's what I want to talk to you about that is in this poll. And if you want to look at the poll for yourself, go to texastaxpayers.com. And if you go to the news, the top bills, TFR releases press release about pressing issues for Texans. I don't remember what the headline is, but they have their press release there, and you can click on it. You can read all of what I'm about to talk to y'all about. Here's what I want to hone in on before I go through the specific things they polled and the answers. Remember that the group of voters that you're about to hear what their opinion is, are only voting for Donald Trump in this survey 48 to 43. 5-point advantage. Less than a majority of the people taking this poll are actually planning on voting for Donald Trump. So let's see what they think about issues. Texans for Fiscal Responsibility asked them, do you believe property taxes are too high? 77% said yes. 11% said no. 11%. 1 in 10 Texans said, yeah, property taxes, they're not too high. When you hear people tell you that we've taken care of the property tax issue, you need to tell them nobody believes you. They're too high and they need to come down. If they say, well, we provided you record relief, you tell them it's not enough relief because they're too high. They're too high. Do you believe Kamala Harris and the Democrats will increase, decrease, or keep spending at the current levels on border security if they win the election? 26% said she'll increase it. 38% said she'll decrease it. 26% said she'll maintain the same. 10% said they are unsure. 53% of these respondents said Kamala Harris and Democrats will raise your tax burden if elected. They know that Democrats will raise taxes. I think this one's really interesting, though. Do you believe Texas should pass an E-Verify law to protect American jobs and stop citizens from taking them? 55% said yes. 28% said no. Remember, 43% are voting for Kamala. 48% are voting for Trump. So you have people that either aren't sure who they're voting for or are voting for Kamala that say we need E-Verify in Texas. So when people tell you that passing E-Verify is some crazy right-wing idea, they're nuts. Because in a poll that Trump's only leading by 5%, E-Verify is leading by 27%. Number 13, this will kind of actually apply to the same conversation we'll have at the very end about the Robert Roberson case, but there's this big push every 2 years. The same people that try to get every death row inmate out of the death penalty also try to siphon money away from our budget to put money into the prison system. They want to put more AC in the prison system. And so there's this big push every 2 years. We need to get AC systems in all of our prisons. We need to get AC systems in all of our prisons. And so the Texans for Fiscal Responsibility asks, should the Texas legislature prioritize taxpayer dollars on air conditioning for convicted criminals in prison or property tax relief? It's a pretty great question, by the way. 60% said tax relief, 20% said AC. That means you have Kamala Harris voters that are like, hey, give me property tax relief. Don't give those prisoners air conditioning. Do you believe Texas should ban subdivisions and agencies from hiring lobbyists to lobby the legislature? 67% said yes, and 6% said no. Again, guys, Trump's leading by 5 points in this poll, but banning taxpayer-funded lobbying is leading by 61%. And yet leadership in the Texas House, the Republicans team up with the Democrats and kill that bill. Do you believe the Texas legislature should pass legislation preventing China and Chinese nationals from acquiring land in Texas? Texans for Fiscal Responsibility has been one of the strongest voices on this issue. They held a lot of Republicans accountable and talked about this issue during the primary. And they've been very involved in the legislative process on the policy. Again, Democrats said Republicans were racist for pushing this. But 76% of Texas general election voters said, yes, we should ban China and Chinese nationals from acquiring land in Texas. And 13% said no. I want you to understand, 43% of these voters are voting for Kamala Harris. Only 13% said no. Guys, a majority of Democrats support banning Chinese nationals from owning Texas land. A majority of Democrats. These radical leftists in the Texas House, and that includes some of these Republicans, are completely out of touch with Texans. Completely out of touch with Texans. It is absolutely incredible to recognize just, Andy Hopper had a great tweet, and I didn't pull it up, but he just said, and he's going to be one of the great freshmen coming in this session. He said, it is so remarkable, the chasm between what lawmakers in Austin care about and what Texans and grassroots activists know we need. We need to work on. Needs to be done. I think it was something like that. It is incredible, the chasm between what the Austin bubble cares about and what Texans and grassroots activists know needs to be done. And what's encouraging about so many of these guys coming in is that they're going to bridge that chasm. They're going to be voices that go in and go, y'all don't understand, which is why so many of you lost your re-elections. You lost your re-elections because you didn't understand how wide the chasm was. And that's what we're going to build the bridge to. And if you go back and listen to the conversation I had with David Cook, one of the things you'll hear is a conversation about how that chasm gets bridged. And I think that's an important conversation to have. Do you believe the Texas legislature should prohibit local governments from increasing taxes without voter approval? Again, right now, your cities and everybody can raise your taxes without getting your voter approval on it. Okay? But if they raise it over a certain number, then they have to get your approval. Many people believe it should be capped at zero new taxes, zero tax increases unless the voters approve it. 79% of Texans believe that should happen. Only 14% oppose it. This is another one where a majority of Democrats are going to support this, a vast majority of independents, and probably 95% of Republicans. It is an easy issue.
America is at a crossroads. Now, more than ever, Texas must step up and lead the country. We don't have time to mess around. The only way to save America is with a strong Texas. You and I know this, but so do the enemies of life and liberty. Therefore, you and I have no choice but to stand up and fight. I'm Sarah Gonzalez, and to the enemies of liberty, I say, come and take it.
Last question on the survey. State lawmakers have been discussing the need for water infrastructure investments. Do you believe that funding should be paid for out of the base budget of $300 billion or out of the surplus dollars that would otherwise go to property tax relief? And this is a great question that should frame our conversation around new government spending. You are going to hear these politicians go on television, all these places, and go, you don't understand. We need roads. We need water. Okay? And they're describing the base role that government plays. This would be like me pulling my family together and going, guys, I got news for you. We need to pay the San Antonio water systems if the water's going to keep coming. It's like, yeah, you got to pay SAWS. It's one of the first bills. If you don't pay SAWS, you don't have water. So this is a base need. It's one of the core functions of government. But the reason many of them are doing this is because they actually want to spend the excess dollars we have on that. We have an over $20 billion surplus. And they want to take a big chunk of that surplus money and say, let's work on the grid and let's build water infrastructure. And the thing is, we should build water infrastructure and we should invest in a strong grid, 100%. But we should do that by cutting the existing budget. And it's so much easier for politicians because they have this pile of money to just fund some stuff they want and then take, I don't know, maybe 50% or 40% of the surplus and go, hey, do a homestead exemption, some property tax relief just to be able to say we did this. But it's clear, again, even in a poll that Trump's only winning by 5, the idea of spending those base infrastructure needs out of the base budget versus the surplus is a 53 to 24 issue. It's a 29% chasm. So Texans know that we should fund those kind of projects from our base budget, not the pile of money that is over tax collection that could be returned to taxpayers in the form of property tax relief. I hope y'all go to texastaxpayers.com, read the poll for yourself. Another insight into a little bit of polling before we move on to the next thing is Kerry Cheshire tweeted this out because the Texas Politics Project released their poll and a couple insights he had made to it because I didn't have a time to download that poll and read it. But the Republican Party actually has a higher approval rating than at any time. It's like an 11-point advantage. 50% of Texas general election voters view the Republican Party positively and 39% negatively. So when you hear this from the media that says, oh my gosh, our politicians are pushing all these conservative policies and it's making them very unpopular in Texas, it's like, no, Texans like the fact that Republicans are running Texas. That is one reason that almost all of them won by a 10-point margin and some of them won by larger. It makes sense. By an 11-point margin, Texans like the fact that Republicans are running Texas. And Chairman Abraham George and Chairman Matt Rinaldi and others have been doing a great job messaging those victories and doing so in a way that continues to keep the Republican Party in a positive position with Texans. But the other observation that Carrie made that I really do think is pretty remarkable is that the most popular major politician on the ballot this November is J.D. Vance in Texas. And just to give you perspective, Colin Allred had a 40% approval, 39% disapproval. And this poll was done, a little over a week ago. So 40-39. Tim Walz had a 41% approval, 43% disapproval, so -2. Kamala Harris had a 44% approval and a 50% disapproval, so a -6. Ted Cruz had a 45% approval and a 43% disapproval, that's a +2. Donald Trump has a 47% approval, 48% disapproval, that's a -1. And then J.D. Vance had a 48% approval and a 40% disapproval. That is an 8-point positive total approval rating. And this is remarkable because when J.D. Vance walked in, all you heard was how he was pulling down the ticket because he was the least popular person. And all these moderates went on, and Karl Rove, who's a Texan, goes on all these places. This is horrible. This is a horrible pick. This guy is so bad. And then all these hit pieces about J.D. Vance, but he goes out there and he just continues to plug away. I just listened to his 2 hours with Theo Vaughn that he did. It's a podcast interview for 2 hours. It's a great podcast if you want to go there and listen to it. He did a phenomenal job. Of course, his vice presidential debate performance was probably the best vice presidential debate performance in modern history. It might be one of the better Republican debate performances in any general election in modern history. Did an absolutely phenomenal job. And you see that not only has he solidified Republicans, but even independents have significantly softened toward him. And Democrats have become a little less angry at him. So overall, J.D. Vance has done a phenomenal job positioning himself to help lead the Republican Party moving forward. And I think that is a very encouraging thing for us because J.D. Vance has an understanding of the important populist policies that actually are in the best interest of citizens, while also having, I think everybody would admit now, having watched him for a while, an incredible ability to communicate these things in a way that people are open to hearing. I said my wife's favorite politician probably is J.D. Vance, and it's not because she follows politics and does a lot of it. It's just because she read his book, Hillbilly Elegy. Oh, sorry, guys, tongue twister. She read his book, Hillbilly Elegy, and she reads close to 50 books a year, even with 4 kids. And it was her favorite book that year that she read it. And so she feels like has a personal connection with this guy, that she has probably a pretty significant amount of insight into his life and upbringing, more than we would normally have for a vice presidential candidate. So that's an encouraging thing to see. The last thing I will talk about, and I'm not going to opine on this significantly, but you can follow me on Twitter or X. I've been getting away from calling it Twitter, guys. I'm getting better. It took a little while to unplug. But you can follow me on X if you want to see more and more of my commentary on this particular case. Robert Roberson is the latest individual that the Innocence Project, which is a national group funded by George Soros. Robert Roberson is the latest gentleman picked for them to stop the execution of and get him off of death row. They're actually now kind of going so far as to try to actually get the guy out of prison entirely. So it's not just not having him executed, but getting him out of prison entirely. And if you listen to this show in your car and you have kids or whatever, I would definitely not recommend you continue listening. This is not going to be graphic. I'm not going to get really graphic, but we're still talking about actions done by an individual that warranted the death penalty. Okay, so I just want to kind of get that out of the way. I always like giving a little bit of a heads up before we go into a little more serious matter like this. My mom would drive around listening to the radio, and you never knew it was coming up. So they just bring something up, and she'd just turn the volume down, right? When I was a kid. So I think of that all the time. And for those of you who listen to this with kids, I just want to like give you the heads up. Robert Roberson is an individual who committed a crime 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, he killed his 2-year-old daughter. And he, after killing his 2-year-old daughter, he was not only arrested, he was tried. There was a trial. There was a jury. There was a judge. There was defense, and there was prosecution. And both sides made their case in a court. And it didn't matter if the lead detective thought he did it. It didn't matter if the DA was convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that this man definitely murdered his daughter. It didn't matter if the judge said, I know he's guilty. Because ultimately, the people who have to decide on someone's guilt or innocence is a jury of their peers. And the jury of his peers, and they don't decide, by the way, and then have to then for the next 20 years completely never doubt their decision. That's actually not how the justice system works. That would be an unjust system. If we basically said, now go out in the world, come back. You have to sequester them for a time being, give them information, let them decide, let them deliberate, and let them deliver justice. And then there is an appeals process. And this is unfortunate because I think my personal opinion is that we take far too long to deliver justice after the juries have delivered it. Okay. We have people who have been on death row in Texas for 20 and 30 years. And then we're having these arguments over a crime that was committed decades ago. But Robert Roberson is found guilty. And then, as happens, the national liberal forces come in and just continue to appeal this entire process. And through that appeals process, they have laid this case before judge after judge after judge after judge. There was one person I was talking to yesterday who I don't always align with politically by any stretch of the imagination, but they are a Republican and they're, let's say, just not. But they said something like, "This thing's been before 100 judges." I don't know if it's actually been before 100 judges, but it's been before a lot of judges because that's how the appeals process works. And the appeals courts have turned Robert Roberson down. And the Court of Criminal Appeals have turned him down. And the Texas Supreme Court have turned him down time and time and time again. And the way this process works is that you go to the court system and you ask them to do all these things. And if they turn you down, your last option is the Board of Pardons and the governor. And the Board of Pardons can recommend to the governor a significant reprieve. And then the governor can either grant that reprieve, or the governor can also himself, without anybody telling him to do anything, grant an extension to someone's execution. Okay? All of these paths were pursued, but the Texas House of Representatives had a problem. This bipartisan Republican-led Democrat-led Republican coalition, because it's almost all the Democrats and then a smaller group of Republicans. This group, they have a problem that the executive branch and the judicial branch have not done what they want them to do. And this is the same problem they had with Ken Paxton. Remember, the Texas House of Representatives had a problem. They knew, I say knew, quote unquote, but in their minds, they knew that Ken Paxton was guilty. So it didn't matter if the DA couldn't find evidence to prosecute. It didn't matter if the FBI couldn't find anything to indict Ken Paxton on. It didn't matter that the judicial system would eventually have to throw out a lot of the cases against him. Didn't matter. They knew he was guilty. And they were going to be the judge, jury, and executioner of Ken Paxton. And that's what started this sham impeachment process. So take that same mindset and fast forward. They now know that Robert Roberson is innocent. It doesn't matter what the jury determined at the time of the trial. It doesn't matter what all of the judges have affirmed for the last 20 years. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to give you a perspective on the Board of Pardons, parole and pardons. I disagree with decisions they have made regarding multiple people who I think were deserving of execution. Melissa Lucio is one of those. And I think that she did horrendous, horrific things when she ended the life of her daughter. And a jury agreed with me. And then the Board of Paroles and Pardons decides we should delay the execution. And I say that to say that this is not a board that just signs off on every execution. And they were petitioned. And I personally thought that even though the judicial system was holding fast, that the executive branch would likely sign off on this, just because they have, when the Innocence Project has pushed 2 different executions in recent years that they wanted delayed. And ultimately, they don't want them delayed. They want them ended, right? And so the Board of Paroles and Pardons unanimously says, no, this execution must continue. And then the governor has a chance, and he opts not to use his authority. Now, there's been some language, you'll see a lot on the left, that basically, like, if the governor doesn't take action, the Board of Paroles and Pardons doesn't take action, they will come in and say, those people have decided to kill Robert Roberson. And that is not true. It is not how the justice system works. The governor does not end the life of people on death row. Those individuals' actions, and then the subsequent jury's decision, and then the subsequent and then all the judges are doing. The judges aren't deciding when these cases are brought to them whether to end this person's life or not. The person decided to end their life when they committed the crime and they were found guilty of it. And the judicial system just reviews the information to see if there's something wrong and then makes a ruling on that. And that's how a justice system works. The Texas House of Representatives decided, we know better. So they issued a subpoena. This has never been done before. And they said, we want to interview Robert Roberson on Monday, and his execution was set for Saturday. And then they took that to the Court of Criminal Appeals and said, you need to stop his execution so we can talk to him. And the Court of Criminal Appeals said, no, this is basically like, put the legislative branch back in its place. And then they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court stayed, issued a temporary restraining order and stopped the execution from happening. This last week, both the Attorney General Ken Paxton and Governor Greg Abbott both filed very important actions at the Supreme Court, an amicus brief from the governor. And of course, the Attorney General has been standing for the young girl who was killed, and also standing for the separation of powers and standing for our justice system, and have been pushing back against this. And the governor also filed a great amicus brief that talked about the significant overreach that this was by a legislative body who have successfully delayed this execution at least 90 days. And don't ask me to explain the entire process, but essentially, Robert Roberson's execution can now not happen until mid-January. And so the interesting thing is, and this Tony McDonald predicted this on Saturday. He said, the Texas House Committee will not interview Robert Roberson on Monday. They just got a temporary restraining order that stopped the execution, and they're not going to interview him on Monday because it's a game. And lo and behold, Monday comes around. They did interview John Grisham, the novelist, at their committee hearing. So John Grisham, I guess he talked about the Pelican Brief and all this other stuff. He comes in, but no Robert Roberson. And they decided he was going to interview via Zoom because the man's in prison, by the way, on death row. And they want the theatrics of him in person. So they said, if you're not going to bring him in person, we don't even want to talk to him. And you might say, well, why? Well, because as soon as they've talked to him, it's done. You can't say, well, we need to subpoena him again. We need to keep talking to him, because then it's very clear, which is what we know. They're just subpoenaing him so that you can't execute justice in this case. It's a very sad thing to watch. It's very frustrating for many Texans. The death penalty is strongly supported by Texans. 9 in 10 Republicans support the death penalty. A majority of independents and a strong number of Democrats. I can't remember the last poll I looked at. It was like 25 or 30% of Democrats support the death penalty. 30% of Democrats in the Texas House do not support the death penalty. But 30% of Democrats out there in Texas do. Unfortunately, 9 out of 10 Republicans in the Texas House don't support the death penalty. I would definitely say 9 out of 10 Republicans in the Texas Senate support the death penalty, but not in the Texas House. Texans believe that our justice system should work. And again, I don't need to go into all. I could do an episode on this, but I don't think that's necessary. What is necessary is for you to know that the Texas House of Representatives has acted significantly outside of the role that they play in the government process. They are the government, right? Your state representative, they're the government. They're not individual citizens. They, as the government, not only believe that they're part of the government, they think that they are the final say, that they are the judge, jury, and executioner, that they are the executive and judicial and legislative branch. And this type of mentality has to stop. It has to stop. I've talked about how the Texas House has been at war with the lieutenant governor and the attorney general and the Republican Party of Texas. And now they're roping the judiciary into their war. They're growing the number of people they're at war with. They're like, we're not at war with enough Republicans. Let's go to war with all the Republicans in the judiciary. It's very unfortunate. And ultimately what has happened is that justice has been delayed, which is also justice denied. And it's not it is this type of anarchy and disorder that should not exist in a peaceful and ordered society. I had a conversation with a Lutheran pastor on the death penalty, and one of the things that we as Lutherans believe is that the state has been given the sword, right? And we see that in Scripture, that the state has been given the sword. And the way he articulated it at the time was that the church believes that the state, because the church doesn't have the sword, okay? We cannot, as a church, decide to execute someone. We don't believe that. We believe. Then the question is, who gets to decide that? And the answer is the state. Scripture makes that clear. The state has been given the sword to bring about small deaths to prevent larger death, more death. Meaning, death is not something that we were designed, created to experience. We brought death into the world. Death was not something we were created to originally experience. Romans 5 says that sin entered the world through one man and death through sin. And so death spread to all men, for all have sinned. We don't rejoice in anyone's death, and you shouldn't. I would say that even applies to those who are justly executed. I don't think that's something we rejoice in, because death is only among us because of sin. The greatest news of all is that Christ brought us life, and I try not to preach to y'all too much, but that is a core reality that we can't escape. And I've been reminded about this, and I've tried to keep this kind of at the forefront, even in all of this discussion about the death penalty, because it's not something that we actually rejoice in. There will be no death penalty in heaven. Thanks be to God. On this side of eternity, God saw fit to give the state the sword to exercise justice. And then our founders saw fit to create 3 legislative branches that each have a role to play. And right now, one branch led by Jeff Leach and Joe Moody have decided that they are all 3 branches. They have delayed and denied justice for a small 2-year-old girl who was killed over 20 years ago. It's very unfortunate. I hope, though we're ending on this note, I do hope that each and every one of y'all understand that less than 2 weeks from now, we will have a president, a new vice president. We will have new leaders across the state of Texas and Congress. And then we will set forth for 2 years to do the work that we are called to do and govern and enact policy. I hope you realize that over the next 2 weeks, you are in a position where you will have an opportunity to further engage and participate in this process to set Texas on a better path. May God bless you, and may God bless the great state of Texas.
Do you want to get your news from people who share your values? Texas Scorecard, real news for real Texans.